Alright, greetings to the gods. Peace. Welcome back to my channel. So today we're continuing Encyclopedia Britannica's Banks and Banking. We're taking it from the reserve question. The figures fluctuate more severely than those than these decennial averages show, and the progress has not been one of uniform increase. Thus, the 15,100,000 in 1885 was followed by 12,700,000 in 1888. The 29 million of 1895 was followed by 34,600,000 pounds in 1896 and 21,200,000 pounds in 1899. Beyond or side by side with the reserve of the Bank of England, there are the reserves held by the other banks. Part of these are held in the form of balances at the Bank of England, part in specie, gold or silver, and banknotes in their own tills. The latter, hence, are not unlikely to be estimated twice over. The published figures on this point are meagre. The expectations expressed by Sir Robert Peel in his speech on the bank charter and the currency of the 6th of May 1844 have not yet been fulfilled. Quote, I rejoice, end quote, he said, quote, on public grounds, in the hope that the wisdom of Parliament will at length devise measures which shall inspire just confidence in the medium of exchange, shall put a check on improvident speculation, and shall ensure the just reward of industry and the legitimate profit of commercial enterprise conducted with integrity and controlled by provident calculation. End quote. The extreme measures which have been required since the Act of 1844 point out for themselves the necessity for reform. 3 times since the date of the Bank Act of 1844, it has been needful to give permission for the suspension of that act which forms the very foundation of the monetary system of Great Britain. This, whenever it has occurred, has exercised a very injurious effect on credit abroad as well as on prosperity at home. The British money market, the clearing house of the world, is in consequence of the smallness of its reserve exposed to greater fluctuations than that of any other country. These fluctuations may arise from the need of meeting the requirements of other countries for specie, that's gold and silver, or those arising from domestic trade. The recorded excess of imports over exports, 147 million pounds in 1906, though the difference is eventually balanced by the invisible exports, gives foreign nations at times a power over the British money market greater than has ever previously been the case. The current must always have a tendency to flow outwards. This is enhanced by the great increase in the number of foreign banks which have branches in England. The need of providing sufficient reserves to meet requirements thus occasioned is obvious. So, British banking abroad. As regards the banks in which British interests are concerned in British colonies and other countries, we can only speak briefly. It must not be overlooked that in the Dominion of Canada there are 29 banks, many of them large, managed much on the Scottish principle with capitals of nearly 19 million pounds and deposits of about 140 million pounds. These banks have more than 1,200 offices. In Australia and New Zealand, there are 24 banks with capitals of nearly 18 million pounds and deposits of about 130 million pounds. pounds. The number of offices is nearly 1,700. There are included the 3 presidency banks, about 15 banks doing business mainly in India, in some cases connecting neighboring countries and places like Bangkok, Hong Kong, and Zanzibar. These banks have capitals of more than £5 million and deposits of fully 36 million and over 210 offices. There are at least 8 banks in South and West Africa with capitals of nearly £5 million, deposits of nearly £50 million, and nearly 370 offices. There are 5 banks, including the Colonial Bank, in other British territories with capitals of about £1 million and deposits of £3,300,000 and about 25 offices. So there are thus, besides many private firms doing very considerable business, more than 80 joint stock British banks working in the colonies with capitals amounting to £48 million, deposits £360 million, and offices 3,505. Outside British territories, there are 6 banks, principally in South America, with nearly £4 million capital and £36 million deposits and about 60 offices. There are 6 large banks doing business principally in the East with more than £6,700,000 capitals and £77 million deposits and 106 offices. And 7 other banks, including Barings, with about £4,500,000 capitals and £22 million deposits. There are thus about 20 British banks doing business in foreign countries with capitals amounting to £15,200,000 and deposits £135 million and offices 173. In this statement, we have included only the more important banks, which collectively wield about £63 million capital and more than £495 million deposits. In all, about £560 million of resources operating at about 3,700 offices situated in places as different from each other and as widely separated as California and Hong Kong, Constantinople and New Zealand, and all of them under the British colonies and doing business under the British banking system. France. In France, the first bank of issue, originally called the Banque Generale, was established in 1716 by John Law, the author of the Mississippi Scheme and the Système. Law's bank, which had been converted into the Banque Royale in 1718, and its notes guaranteed by the King Louis XV, came to an end in 1721. An attempt at reconstruction was made in 1767, but the bank thus established was suppressed in 1793. Other banks, some issuing notes, then carried on operations with limited success, but these never attained any real power. There were many negotiations on the subject of the establishment of a bank in 1796. The financial difficulties of the times prevented any immediate result, but the advice of those engaged in this plan was of great assistance to Napoleon I, who, aided by his minister Moulin, founded in 1800 the Bank of France, which has remained from that time to the present by far the most powerful financial institution in the country. The objects for which it was established were to support the trade and industry of France and to supply the use of loanable capital at a moderate charge. These functions it has exercised ever since with great vigor and great judgment, extending itself through its branches and tongues attached to branches over the whole country. At its establishment, and for some time subsequently, the operations of the bank did not extend over the whole of France. Departmental banks with the privilege of issue had been formed under the law adopted in 1803. At the close of 1847, there were 9 of these banks existing in as many of the larger towns. In 1848, however, they were absorbed into the Bank of France, which has since possessed an exclusive privilege of issue, and in 1863 took over the Bank of Savoy after that province was united to France. The Bank of France has successfully surmounted many political as well as financial troubles both during and since the times of Napoleon I. The overthrow of the government of Louis Philippe in 1848, the war with Germany in 1870, the many difficulties that followed when the Commune reigned in Paris in 1871, the payment of the war indemnity, not completed till 1873, were all happily overcome. Great pains, too, have been taken, especially of recent years, to render services to large and small businesses and to agriculture industry. In 1877, the offices of the Bank of France were 78 in number. In 1906, they were 447, including the tongues, quote, connected with the branches, end quote. An arrangement which, without putting the bank to the expense of opening a branch, gives the place connected many of the advantages which a branch confers. The quantity of commercial paper discounted is very large. More than 20 million bills were discounted in 1906, the total amount being £559,234,996. The advances on securities were in the same year £106,280,124. The rate of discount in Paris is as a rule lower and the number of alterations fewer than in London. From May 1900 to January 1906, there was no change, the rate remaining uniformly at 3%. Bills as low as 4 shillings or 2d are admitted to discount, including those below 8s. About 232,000 of this class were discounted in 1906. Since the 27th of March 1890, loans of a small an amount of £10 are granted. In most cases, 3 names must be furnished for each bill, or suitable guarantees or security given. But these necessary safeguards have not to be furnished in such a manner as to hamper applicants for loans unduly. In this manner, the Bank of France is of great service to the industry of the country. It has never succeeded, however, in attracting deposits on anything, like the scale of the Bank of England or the banks of the English-speaking peoples, but it held, as stated in the balance sheet for the 23rd of December 1906, about £35 million in deposits, of which 14 million was on account of the Treasury and 21 million for individuals, and the amount held in this manner gradually increases. The report for 1904 says, quote, each year the movement in these increases, and this economical and safe mode of effecting receipts and payments is more and more appreciated by the public. End quote. In one respect, the Bank of France stands at a great advantage in connection with this branch of its business. The average amount held in this manner for individuals during 1906 was about £23 million. As the accounts numbered 77,159, the average for each account was comparatively small. Amounts so subdivided give a great probability of performance. The figures so subdivided give a great probability of performance. The figures of the accounts for 1904 were as follows. 11,178 current accounts with power of discount. 4,576 simple current accounts, 26,000 current accounts with advances, and 24,106 accounts deposits. Total 66,569 accounts against 59,182 at the end of 1903. At the present time, the Bank of France operates chiefly through its enormous note circulation, averaging in 1906 £186,300,000. by means of which most business transactions in France are carried on. And remember, a note is a promissory note because the bank would hold the gold species for the depositors and give them a certificate or a note, and they will use the note, circulate it in the public, and then whoever have the note to go back to the bank and redeem the note for the gold. So just remember, note is a promissory note. The bank promissory note promising to pay, right? The limits of the circulation of the Bank of France and the dates when it has been extended are as follows. So these are the dates here, the millions of francs, converting the francs as 25 equal £1, right? There are figures on a table there. So you could probably pause and go through the table there. So most business transactions in France are liquidated, not in checks as in England, but in notes of the Bank of France. These, owing to their convenience, are preferred to specie. Most business transactions in France are liquidated, not in checks as in England. So in England they use checks, but in notes of the Bank of France. So in France they use notes, so promissory notes issued by the Bank of France. These, owing to their convenience, as preferred to specie. So the people prefer to use the notes because paper much easier to carry around than chunks and coins of gold or silver. You're walking and it's rattling in your pocket. It's heavy. It weighing on your pants. It might burst a hole in your pocket and it might fall out and lost, right? So the notes were easier to and more convenient to use as opposed to specie, gold or silver. This is accumulated in the vault of the Bank of France, which in 1906 held an average of 115 million pounds gold and 42 million pounds silver. All right, so that is the specie. When they say specie, they talk about gold and silver. So the banks then were trust banks. They held gold and silver for the depositors. The gold held by the Bank of France is generally considerably larger in amount than that held by the Bank of England, which in the autumn of 1890 had to borrow 3 million pounds in gold from the Bank of France at the time of the barring crisis. So the Bank of England had to borrow 3 million in gold, 3 million pounds in gold from the Bank of France during the barring crisis. The large specie reserve of the bank has given stability to the trade of France because the notes backed by gold, it will have stability. You won't have inflation. You will have substance financing. You could pay for things, right? So the large specie reserve of the bank has given stability to the trade of France and has enabled the bank to manage its business without the numerous fluctuations in the rate of discounts which are constantly occurring in England. So they didn't have all this inflation, all this debasing of the currency and more printing of the currency. Because if I deposit one gram of gold and I get a certificate for 1 gram of gold, right? That is all I can get off of that gram of gold, right? So they maintain a standard. So it is true that the holding this very large amount of specie imposes a very heavy burden on the shoulders of the shareholders of the bank, but they do not complain. The advantage to business from the low rate of interest which has to be paid for the use of borrowed capital in France is a great advantage to the trade and industry of that country. So we continuing. The mass of the reserve in France is so great that the movements of the precious metals, when they are the result only of natural causes, are allowed to go on without corresponding movements in the discount rate. But it must be remembered that this large reserve is held in part against a gigantic note issue, and also that the trade activity and enterprise of the French people are less intense than in either the United Kingdom or Germany. Thus, it is much easier for the Bank of France to maintain a steady rate of discount. Okay. So besides the Bank of France, several great credit institutions carry on business in the country, as the Banque de Paris et des Pays Bas, capital and reserve 3,729,000 pounds. Other liabilities, deposits, etc. 14,842,000 pounds. France, the Banque Francaise pour le commerce et, I probably butcher that. Anybody speaks French? Can pronounce that for me. 2,450,000 pounds and 3,505,000 pounds. The credit Lyoness 14 million pounds and 82,570 pounds. Yeah, guys, I apologize for that. That's my dog in the background there. And the Société Générale pour Favoriser, all right, French. So it's 7,469,000. This is the reserves, and then this is the deposits. So the first one is the reserves in all of them, and the second is the deposit, right? 45,800,000 deposits. Right, 1,600,000 and 10,060,000. So there is also the Credit Foncier de France with a very considerable capital, but the business done is so largely that the mortgages is debt pledge. So mortgage means debt pledge, that it can hardly be included among banks, though it carries on in some measure the business of banking. So besides the 6 important joint stock banks mentioned above, there exists in France a large number of banks, principally in the provinces, carrying on a very considerable business. Little is known as to their deposits, but their business appears to be conducted with great prudence and discretion. 182 of these firms were members of the French Country Bankers Association in 1898. They carry on business in 66 out of the 86 departments into which France is divided. More than one of these banks has several offices, one possessing 18, including the head office. These branches are situated in the small towns in the vicinity. In this, the business follows more the English method of small branches. The French Country Bankers Association holds its meetings in Paris, where matters of interest to bankers are discussed. See Bankers Magazine, July 1898. Germany. Besides the Imperial Bank of Germany, the Reichsbank, there are about 140 banks doing business in the States, which form the German Empire. These credit and industrial banks, with their large resources, have had an immense influence in bringing about the astonishing industrial development of their country. 5 banks possess the right of uncovered note issue. And I think what I mean here when they say uncovered note issue means that they can issue notes without having gold and silver backing the notes. So the notes are uncovered. So the Imperial Bank of Germany with the right of issue, Bank of Saxony, Bavaria, Württemberg, and Baden. So at the Bank of Germany, the coin and bullion held is sometimes larger than at the Bank of England. The statement of the specie in the weekly accounts includes silver. The amounts held in gold and silver only separated once a year, when the balance sheet is published. The figures of the balance sheet for the 31st of December 1906 showed in round numbers 24 million pounds gold and 9 million pounds silver. As far as the capital is concerned, the 18 million pounds of the Bank of England considerably exceeds the 9 million pounds of the Bank of France and the 12,200,000 pounds of the Bank of Germany. The note circulation of both the other banks is considerably larger than that of the Bank of England. That of the Bank of France being £186,300,000, and of the Imperial Bank of Germany £69 million in 1906. So you realize that they have more notes circulating than gold and silver on reserves, right? So that should tell us something. So we see that the banks were issuing more notes to the gold deposited. So let's say one customer deposited one brick of gold and got a certificate. Because the depositors weren't returning a lot of depositors weren't returning to redeem the gold, the banks would have probably started to issue more notes on the gold. So instead of issuing one note, they would issue 10 notes on one piece of gold, right? So we could keep that in mind. The capitals and reserve of the German banks, including those of banks established to do business in other countries, as South America and the Far East, and of the Bank of Germany are about £133 million, with further resources including deposits, notes, and mortgage bonds, amounting to fully £414 million. The amount of the capital compares very closely with that of the capitals of the banks of the United Kingdom. The deposits are increasing. The deposits, however, are not the whole of the resources of the German banks. The banks make use, besides of their acceptances, in a manner which is not practiced by the banks of other countries, and the average note circulation of the Reich Bank, included in the statement given above, is between £60 million and £70 million. A large and apparently increasing proportion of the resources of the German banks is employed in industrial concerns, some of which are beyond the boundaries of the empire. The dangers of this practice have called forth many criticisms in Germany, among which many be quoted the remarks of Caesar Strauss and of Dr. R. Koch, the president of the Reich Bank. Dr. Koch especially points out the need of the development of powerful banks in Germany, unconnected with speculative business of this kind. The object of employing their funds thus is the higher rate of interest to be obtained from these investments than from discounting bills or making loans at home. But such an employment of the resources of a bank is opposed to all regular rules of business and of banking tradition, which abstains from making fixed investments of any large part of the resources of a bank. On the other hand, Dr. Koch observes that the risks of the one reserve system mentioned by Bagot are not to be feared in Germany. We have a footnote, and it's in French, right? Dr. Koch, page 163 to 164, right? So the recent movement in favor of concentration among the banks has been described by Dr. E. Despetier and Dr. Reiser, who give particulars of the business done by these banks, which does not correspond with banking as practiced in the United Kingdom, being more of an industrial character. There are also many private banking firms in Germany which do a considerable amount of business. The Reich Bank, by far the most powerful banking institution in Germany, is managed by the bank directory appointed by the Chancellor of the Empire. The shareholders join in the management through a committee of which each member must be qualified by holding not less than 3 shares. The government exercises complete powers of control through the Chancellor of the Empire. The influence of the Imperial Bank now permeates, by means of its branches, all the separate kingdoms of the empire. The uniformity of coinage introduced through the laws of 1871 to 1873 rendering this possible. The Imperial Bank assists business principally in 2 ways. First, through the clearing system, the Giro Verkehr or Worker, which it has greatly developed, and secondly, through the facilities given to business by its note circulation. The Imperial Bank also receives deposits and checks are drawn against these. But in Germany, notes are principally used in payments of ordinary business. All right, guys. So we're going to stop there. We're going to stop right here. And we're going to continue from there the next day. So one thing I want you guys to take away from this is the fact that during this period, banks use specie, gold and silver. They held gold and silver for depositors and issued notes. All right, and notes, and the depositors would use the notes to do business. So the notes were backed by gold and silver. All right. So thank you for your time and patience. Remember, strengthen body, powers, and mind. We can't look for help from anybody. We have to help ourselves. In anything that we do, we have to help ourselves. Right? So the helping hand that you're looking for is at the end of your arm. All right? So stay up.